Thank you, everyone, for joining me for these live internet studies week after week. My name is Ariel Ben Lyman Hanavi. The entire live internet study show is an hour and a half long. There are two segments. The first segment is entitled Eschatology, a Biblical Study of End Time Events. We study end time topics like Rapture, Book of Daniel topics, Antichrist, the Olivet Discourse in the Gospels. Mystery Babylon's on our list too. We're not going to forget about that. And Book of Revelation is really kind of where we're headed, and that's going to be quite an undertaking when the time comes. But we're just chugging along slowly. The second 30-minute topic is entitled A Trinitarian Response to Biblical Unitarianism, and it's where we deal with Trinitarian versus non-Trinitarian discussions. We kind of work our way through different passages. We're using a list that's put together by another group who's non-Trinitarian, called Biblical Unitarianism, Biblical Unitarian. And currently we're going to finish up this verse in the book of Zechariah. We're going to finish that tonight. Okay, let's jump into the first segment. This is an hour-long study, hour-long. Sometimes it might be shorter. It might be shorter tonight. We'll have to see what happens. So we're in topic 12 still, Rapture Views of Final Analysis. We're just taking our time. I'm not in any rush, so I hope you're not. And we've been looking at 4 different views of the rapture, or the historical premillennial view of the rapture question. And what I mean by that is basically there are 4 views that imagine that the rapture is going to happen, and then there will be a millennial kingdom. So that's kind of the big, broad overview. We're in this gap time right now, what some people call the church age, or if you're into dispensationalism, that's what they would call it. And this will finally, one day, bring in this last 7-year time frame that was prophesied in Daniel. And in that time frame, or connected with that time frame somewhere, either at the beginning, in the middle, a little 3/4 of the way in, or at the very end, right? Then we'll have the millennial kingdom brought in, where Yeshua reigns and rules and reigns for 1,000 years. So let's look real quick at the differing views. So you can see them on your screen right now. I've got the pre-tribulation rapture in the upper right corner, and pre-tribulation rapturists believe the church would be raptured before this final 7-year period known as Daniel's 70th week, or known as the 7-year tribulation. So their rapture is right there. In the upper left corner, we have mid-tribulation rapture. They've got a rapture parked right in the middle, so they believe that the rapture will occur exactly halfway through the 7-year period, just before the beginning of the Great Tribulation. I went back and kind of doubled down on what their theology is that drives their understanding of the rapture. And if I remember right, the one of the most well-known proponents, if I remember, Robert Gundry. I might be getting him wrong, getting him confused with someone else, but I believe it's him. I'll fact check myself after the show and then put something in post-production whether or not I was right or wrong. But if I'm correct, if I remember, Gundry really borrows his theology from pre-tribulationism. He's a pre-tribber, but he more, what he thinks accurately times the rapture to the middle of the 70th week, the middle of the 7-year period, because he believes the church is going to go through some tribulation. But theologically, he's a dispensationalist, and he doesn't believe that the church will endure God's wrath. He just believes that the church is going to go through some tough time, and so he pushes the rapture into the middle. He also holds to what he believes is, timing-wise, a rapture at the 7th trumpet, meaning the last trumpet that Paul mentions in 1 Corinthians 15:51 to 52 and 53, somewhere around there. He believes that when Paul says at the last trump, in the twinkling of an eye at the last trump, Paul, of course, there is talking about the resurrection. But we already know that the resurrection and the rapture are synonymous events. Those of us who followed this particular scheme of historical premillennialism understand that rapture and resurrection are synonymous. So he believes that rapture, Gundry, mid-tribber now, he believes that rapture and resurrection are last trumpet, 7th trumpet events. And this is shared this idea that rapture is at the seventh trumpet is shared also by the next group, which is down here at the lower left hand corner, post-tribulationism. Post-tribulation rapturists believe the rapture will occur following the 7-year period known as Daniel's 7th week, or the 7th week of Daniel. So over on their version, as I circle it here, we've got rapture at the far right, far end of the 7th week, but it is combined with what is often termed the second coming. So if you notice, if I look at Pretrib's second coming in the upper left corner one more time, you can see that it is near the very end, right? Somewhere around Battle of Armageddon, Revelation chapter 19, something like that. Mid-tribulation places their rapture also at the very, very end. Remember, mid-tribulationism shares more with pre-tribulationism, as far as I can tell, than it does with post-trib or pre-wrath, as far as the theology driving who they believe will go through the tribulation, who will go through God's wrath, the reason for needing a rapture that's segmented away from the second coming. They share in the theology that pre-trib has already established there. The church and Israel are separate, meaning what I'm trying to say in plain language is a lot of mid-trib's theology is driven by dispensationalism, as far as I can remember from reading Gundry's work. And since pre-trib is really, really big on dispensationalism, church, Israel, two separate things. That's what I mean by dispensationalism. Post-trib pulls away from that. Post-trib says dispensational, church, Israel, two separate things. Nah, we're not too sure about that. We're going to put church and Israel closer together, God dealing with both of them at the same time. And so when we talk about a rapture at the far end of the 7-year time frame, right, post-tribbers say this, then we need the church and Israel to both be raptured and saved at the same time. That's kind of, I think, the theology that they have to work from, because otherwise there's just no time to do anything if everything's smashed into the very end there, kind of collapsed or what do we say, flattened out when we talk about looking at the book of Revelation. And then last on the list, give me a second, this circle's too big, we'll go like that. There we go. The last one on the list is the one that I hold to, the Prewrath Rapture. Let's zoom in and give it some love there. There we go. The Prewrath Rapture, we Prewrathers, we believe the rapture will occur following the opening of the sixth seal of the book of Revelation. The church will experience severe persecution by the Antichrist, but will be snatched away, that is raptured, before God begins to pour out his wrath during the day of the Lord. Okay, so this is our perspective. This means that our rapture is kind of like that. And then you're like, well, where's the second coming? Well, the second coming is kind of like that, which means the rapture is technically the initiating event or program or I always lose words for it because different ways to describe it, but it's part of the second coming. The rapture is part of the second coming. It's the initiation of the second coming. And then this would mean that Armageddon could technically be called the culmination of the second coming. But either way, the rapture, so-called, and the second coming could be thought of as the same thing, just like the Battle of Armageddon and the second coming could be thought of the same thing. And so I'm kind of slowing down in the way I'm describing it because I want people to consider how closely it aligns somewhat in the way I'm describing it with post-tribulationism, but yet radically different in that our rapture in pre-wrath rapture doesn't put our rapture at the very end of the 7th week. It puts it somewhere in between the midpoint and the end of the week. And so if you want to think that sorry, I didn't mean to shrink it that small. If you want to think that it is closely aligned with mid-trib, you're welcome to do so. But I don't like to think that it's close to mid-trib because pre-wrath definitely doesn't hold to this very strong dispensationalistic difference between the church and Israel. We're not dispensationalists in that regard. Although one of these days I'm going to do a dispensational teaching and tell you what I actually believe. The word dispensationalism isn't a bad word, right? And there is some amount of truth that dispensationalism can be. We can keep some of what it borrows and teaches and presents, but a lot of it is gone sour, right? Like milk that's been left out too long. So dispensationalism is not driving the pre-wrath rapture model, nor is an understanding that the rapture and the second coming, so-called, are the same event, quote unquote. So Prewrath pulls away from all three of the other models and tries to synchronize what's going on in the rapture scheme. Okay, so what we've been doing in this Rapture Views of Final Analysis is I've got this file by gotquestions.org. So I've got this teaching by gotquestions.org, which is available on their website at gotquestions.org, and then you can search for Rapture Views or something to that effect. And we worked our way through this question that they asked: what are the strengths and weaknesses of the pre-wrath view of the rapture? Not to confuse anyone, boy, I really had to answer a lot of comments and emails on this one, not just this one, but this whole series of using Got Questions perspective and then adding my own. In my head, it seemed to work. Hey, present what gotquestions.org says, which is a pre-trib ministry. Present their perspective, critique of strengths and weaknesses of any of the four given positions, and then supply my own critique of their critique. And one of those times I did it, I can't remember which one it was. It might have been during the mid. I butchered it. It didn't work. It fell apart. It under its own weight. It was too convoluted. I had people writing in, scratching their head, saying, "What in the world? Who's speaking? Is it Pretrib? Is it Ariel? Or is it gotquestions.org?" They were confused. So I decided to try and separate these and make it very obvious who's talking. So basically, gotquestions.org had their say last week. If I scroll down, you'll notice that they start talking about weakness here, right? One weakness of the pre-wrath position, and then later on they say another flaw. Okay, so they hit basically two main issues. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take those two things that they say are weaknesses. We'll start, and we'll just take them one by one. Their first one says, one weakness of the pre-wrath rapture position is its presumption that the elect mentioned in Matthew 24, 22, and 31 are church age saints. And so, in order to understand their critique of the pre-wrath position, just understand that when we read through the Olivet Discourse passages, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all contain what has been labeled the Olivet Discourse, which is Jesus discussing the end-time events with his disciples on the Mount of Olives. That's why it's called Olivet. Well, in these discussions, he uses this term elect. The Greek word is eklektos. We're going to look at it. Eklektoi. We're going to look at it here in a moment. And he explains to the disciples that during this intense time of suffering and tribulation, etc., persecution, that the elect are going to be persecuted. They're going to be receiving the intense hatred that the world is pouring on them. Wicked humanity, of course, is always going to persecute the righteous. They're always going to try to get back at God because they hate God, driven, of course, by fallen human nature as well as driven by satanic and demonic inspiration and oppression and things like that. Darkness attacks light is the point I'm trying to bring out. And so who is this elect that's going to receive this persecution, be the focal point of being persecuted and have to go through this tribulation? And it's in that discussion about who is this elect that the Pretribbers, launching from their dispensational theology that says that God will not punish his bride. God will separate the church from any persecution. Of course, they should have said God will separate his bride from any wrath, but they conflate these two terms, tribulation and wrath, and combine them, and in so doing, they have to take the church out of anything that smacks of a 70th week of Daniel or a tribulation period, a 7-year tribulation. Another reason they separate the church is because they believe that the time of Jacob's trouble, or the 70th week itself, is rooted in Daniel's prophecies that were given to Daniel and Daniel's people, and that, of course, would be Israel. And since the church and Israel are two separate things, their theology cannot permit them to have the church inside of the last 7 years, because for them, that belongs to Israel. And the church and Israel are two separate things. So we've got kind of two theologies kind of working themselves together. One, the elect cannot be the church in the Olivet Discourses because of the fact that God has exempted his elect, God has exempted his bride from going through wrath or tribulation. And two, the 70th week belongs to Israel. So what does Pretrib, i.e. gotquestions.org, what do they do with the elect mentioned in the Olivet Discourses? Because Jesus uses the word elect. And we're going to find out later on that this word elect is used throughout the New Testament to refer to believers. So what does pre-tribulationism do with that word elect? Very simple. They apply it to the other elect that we find in the Old Testament part of the Bible, namely Israel. And they say Jesus was talking to national Israel. He's talking to believing Jews at the time who are going to be in the tribulation. Or some of them might say this could be tribulation saints. But either way, the bottom line is it's not the church that's in view. And thus, this is their way of taking the church out of the Olivet Discourse, i.e. removing the church from the equation altogether. In plain language, that's what goes on. So they think that pre-tribbers and got questions, they think that since we pre-wrathers, I suppose what I'm about to say would apply to the post-tribbers as well, they think that any position, so let's just put pre-wrath, let's throw pre-wrath and post-trib under the bus at the same time if we're pre-tribbers. Post-tribbers and pre-wrathers, let's throw you under the bus at the same time. A weakness of your position is that presuming that the elect mentioned in Matthew 24 are church-age saints. Nope, that's not going to work, they say. That doesn't work. So how do I answer this charge? Well, here's how I do it. I create an essay called Prewrath Weakness Number 1. The elect of the Olivet Discourse is the church. All right, this is my answer to them. Now, notice I retained their label in my title. The elect of the Olivet Discourse is the church. That's what I'm pushing back against. So this is my essay. Don't confuse my label. I do not believe that it is a weakness that the elect of Olivet Discourse is the church. Okay? I don't believe it's a weakness by saying it's the church. So need to understand my title. In other words, I think the elect is the church, but my understanding of elect includes more than just Christians, but primarily Christians. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me just read down through it. So here's my response to their labeling this as a weakness. That's why I got weakness number 1. The elect of the Olivet Discourse is a church. They think it's a weakness to call the elect a church. What do I have to say about that? Let me offer a pre-wrath response that clarifies how we, pre-wrathers, understand the identity of the elect in Matthew 24:22 and 24:31, as well as the issue of the Sabbath reference in verse 20. I brought that Sabbath reference in because in their answer here that you can see on the screen, I'll just read this real quick. Not going to highlight it, just reading it so you can understand where mine goes. Gotquestions.org, a.k.a. Pretribbers, they say one weakness of the pre-wrath rapper's position is its presumption that the elect mentioned in Matthew 24 are church-age saints. These saints could just as easily be individuals saved during the 7-year tribulation. In fact, Notice what they actually essentially create a term that doesn't exist in the Bible called church age saints. But they said these could be called like what they call them tribulation saints, in fact. So they go, in fact, Jesus tells those who flee the Antichrist persecution to pray that the flight does not occur on the Sabbath, right? Verse 20, which is true. Jesus says that. And what is their response? They say that since the church is not under the Mosaic law and does not keep the Sabbath, Jesus' words cannot be directed to the church. Now, I'm a Messianic Jew. I'm a Torah observant. You could call me a pronomian Christian, which means I believe, actually, that the law of Moses is still relevant for Christians, both Jew and Gentile. So don't even get me started on talking about the church not being under the Mosaic law as part of an answer that's talking about eschatology. I don't want to get sidetracked. That's a completely different argument. But that also drives part of their understanding. They're like, see, here's proof that the elect in the Olivet Discourse can't be the church, because Jesus tells them about, woe unto those who have to take flight on the winter. Pray that your flight, meaning when he says flight there, he's not talking about your airline flight. He's talking about the fact that you have to escape from this intense persecution that's going to suddenly overtake you. And you're going to need to get out of town real quick. And if your flight is a flight, meaning you're fleeing, if you're trying to run away on the Sabbath day, it's going to be a big problem for you. And so got questions, aka the Pretribbers. They're saying there's no way this can be the church, because obviously the church is not under the Mosaic law. So why would Jesus have to mention anything about, fleeing on the Sabbath day? Okay, so let me offer my explanation as well as talking about the Sabbath reference issue in verse 20. All right, so number one, there's only about like 3 or 4 parts to this. This is not very long. Elect in the New Testament, the expanded people of God. Now let's talk about this word elect. The Greek word elect, eklektos or eklektoi sometimes, depending on which case you're finding it in, what the verse says, but I just chose eklektos for my example here. The word eklektos in the New Testament consistently refers to those chosen by God, and crucially, this category now encompasses believers in Jesus Christ, whether Jew or Gentile. So I'm trying to start from a foundational perspective using what the Bible presents to us in the apostolic scriptures, because that's the focus of where I'm addressing their immediate question. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are found in the apostolic scriptures, aka the New Testament. So I'm going to start there first. That's why I say believers in Jesus Christ. However, let me keep reading. It's vital to understand that this inclusion does not imply a replacement of Israel by the church, supersessionism or replacement theology. So both of those two forms of error imagine that the church has somehow either overtaken Israel or replaced Israel. Either way, it feeds into the dispensational perspective that the church in Israel cannot be present at the same time, or God doesn't deal with them at the same time. I shouldn't say present at the same time, because obviously the church is on earth right now, and so is national Israel, unbelieving Israel. We're both here at the same time, but dispensationally speaking, God is only dealing with the church at the moment, and God can't deal with Israel until the church is moved out of the way. Supersessionism and replacement theology neatly line up with that theology of the church in Israel being completely separated. Let me keep reading. Instead, I say that Gentiles who believe in Jesus are grafted into the existing olive tree of Israel, becoming part of God's believing remnant. As taught by Yeshua in the Gospels, note well his sheep and flock with one shepherd language that he uses in different places, right? He says, there's one, I'm that shepherd, there's one shepherd. And when he was having dialogues with his disciples, he let them know that they are his sheep. Those who follow his voice are recognized by the master as his sheep. And he then identified himself as that shepherd. But he hinted at and he let them know that there are other sheep that are not part of his flock that he also needs to gather. And I believe that those are clear references to the non-Jews. But of course, he needed to establish what we could call his power base in Israel first. That's why he told the disciples not to go to the Gentiles at the moment. Just go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel and focus on them. Develop this foundation. I'm filling in. He didn't say that, those words there about developing this foundation. But that must be what he's talking about, because we know that after the first phase of the gospel went to the lost sheep of house of Israel and got formulated so that the messianic leadership was established there among the apostles, then and only then was the gospel then sent to the Gentiles, starting with Paul's missions to the Gentiles. Of course, Yeshua specifically commissioning him, telling him, I'm going to send you to the Gentiles, and you're going to bring more sheep into this fold, and there'll be one shepherd and one flock, right? With one unified people of God, Jew and Gentile. And that's what I say next. So we've got the sheep and flock language with one shepherd from Yeshua himself, and further expounded by Paul in Romans, specifically chapter 11's olive tree teaching, and Ephesians, specifically chapters 2 and 3's fellow heirs teaching. Was my grammar wrong there? Chapters 2 and 3's fellow heirs. I think it's right, but you know what I'm trying to say there. So chapter 2 and chapter 3, Paul breaks out into this. You are fellow heirs. You're part of the same commonwealth of Israel. It draws from the same thing that he's talking about when he talks about the olive tree, that there's one people group who gets connected to an existing people group. That's where I'm going with that. So in this discussion about people groups coming together, that's where we start to think about chosenness. Chosenness based on faith in Messiah. So that's what I mean by elect. While Hashem originally chose ethnic Israel as his eklektoi, now there I use the word eklektoi in the Tanakh instead of eklektos, he chose his eklektoi in the Tanakh, i.e. the Old Testament. The apostolic scriptures, i.e. the New Testament, broadens this elect to include all who respond in faith to the Messiah. It's quite basic, and it clears up so many confusing issues when we're trying to think about other issues as far as application of who's doing what, who has a responsibility to do what, who's going to be left around, who's going to be receiving the persecution, who has to suffer tribulation, who's exempt from God's wrath, who is going to go in the rapture when the time comes. So everything I'm saying right now should be actually very appealing so far to the post-tribbers as well, because they like having the church's rapture and Israel's salvation at the very end of the 70th week. I keep separating from saying Israel's salvation because I don't hear too many people talking about Israel being rapture ready or being raptured at the same time as the church. In other words, are they two separate groups if they're both being raptured? Wouldn't they just be one group known as the church or known as God's people? What do you call the one group that gets raptured? The bride? Well, I think that national Israel isn't going to go when the rapture comes. This is my understanding as a pre-wrather. When the rapture happens, national Israel is going to, for the most part, is going to be left out of that event because she's not rapture ready. She's not ready to meet her Messiah at that moment. However, this doesn't mean that God isn't without mercy, and he does have a plan. If I read Revelation chapter 7 and understand it correctly, at the moment of the rapture, either right before it or synonymous with it, or right after it. Hard to say because the language isn't explicit. But if I just read the narrative, then I would say maybe it happens just before. God is going to seal 144,000 Jewish people, 12,000 from each tribe, quote unquote. Some little difficulties from each tribe. But generally speaking, 12,000 from each tribe, or whatever tribes are represented by the 144,000. And these sealed individuals don't need to be rescued and taken off from planet Earth. Instead, they stay on Earth in order to begin this intense final evangelism that will eventually culminate in the salvation of Israel at the seventh trumpet, aka at the end of the 70th week. So that's why I believe that national Israel doesn't need to go up in the rapture. In fact, they cannot go up in the rapture at the moment because they have rejected their Messiah. They're not rapture ready at this moment. In fact, to push the point, if I were a pre-tribber, I most certainly would not think that national Israel is ready to go now. Because remember, pre-trib has this idea known as imminency. Jesus could come back at any moment, as in no precursor, no signs, no warnings, not even recognizing that there was a rapture, because it's going to be a kind of a dog whistle rapture, meaning only Christians are going to realize what happens in the blink of an eye. To use Paul's words, a twinkling of an eye. All of Christians will be gone from planet Earth. The resurrection itself, I guess, is also going to be a twinkling of an eye event. And the world won't know what happened. They'll just suddenly blink, and then billions of people will be gone, or millions of people, however many they think are Christians now. And national Israel won't go because they're not ready. In fact, they're not ready right now. So if there was a rapture right now, I look around, I look at the news, I'm like, is Israel ready? Do they embrace their Messiah? Not on your life. So that's a good point to think about. But I'm not a pre-tribber. I'm not a post-tribber. I'm certainly not a mid-tribber. I'm a pre-wrather.